Hey guys, it's Drew. Welcome to the show. Today we're going to do a live demo on doing a little maintenance on Neo, and we're going to talk about doing Freehub bearing replacement as well as Neo main disc bearing maintenance. We're also going to try to answer questions as we go, but because we also want to get through this, we may save questions at the end unless what you're asking is like immediately relevant. Because we're doing this live, I just want to let you know we live in a suburb, so there might be weird stuff. Who knows what's going to happen, but let's just try to roll with it the best that we can, and hopefully we're going to have some fun. So hopefully you guys have seen already, Tax has on their website a quick maintenance guide for your Neo, which they recommend that you do annually. And I'm going to tell you right now, that is not sufficient. For our trainers that we own personally and the ones that I work on for my customers, this is something that I do every 3 months, because that kind of preventive maintenance is what's going to clue you in to when those bearings need to be replaced. Because if you go another year, that's when bearings have a chance to fail sort of catastrophically. So we want to catch that before we get to that point. So another thing you've probably seen in every video you've ever seen is to put on safety glasses. For the majority of this, you really don't need them, but I'm going to tell you, put them on right now, because it's easy to forget when they're sitting over to the side. So once they're on your face, you can kind of set it and forget it, and they look really stylish, right? So we're just going to go from here, because some of the stuff you definitely are going to want safety glasses, and we'll get to that, burn that bridge when we get to it. So first things first, to get to the point where you can take a look at the plain bearing behind your cassette, we're going to need some wrenches. So this is the stuff that I use. This is from a German company, and they make really, really nice tools. Another thing, if you are using, this is a quick release that's on the end of this. If you are using a through axle adapter for Neo 2 or for 2T, I just want to show you, there are wrenches that are like this. This is called a thin head wrench. Can you come and take a look at this, please? Like a thin head wrench like this is designed to fit in this groove. So I see a lot of the times when I see you guys' images of what the adapters look like, they're all chewed up because the wrench that you're using is too big. So use the right tool so that you preserve your stuff. So the first thing we're going to do is remove this axle cap. I know you guys have probably seen this a million times, but just trust me, it gets good. So we're going to take the axle cap off, and now we're going to take off the entire cassette. You don't need to take the cassette off for this. We're just going to take the whole thing off, right? Set this aside. So what we want to look at now is this plain bearing, right? This plain bearing has two purposes. One, it is a bushing between the Freehub body and the axle, so that if you never noticed, the inside of the Freehub is slightly wider than the axle, so this prevents some of that vibration, and also is a spacer to provide distance between the back of the Freehub, this part right here, and the inside inner race of the outboard bearing. So that's part of its job, because if that wasn't there, as the disc tried to turn, you wouldn't be able to freewheel. It would really get stuck. So every time you're replacing this, always make sure this is there. So you really want to make sure that you get all the old grease off of this part. It's pretty crucial. All right, now we're just going to set this aside. We know that it's nice and clean, so we're just going to set it aside for now. So the next thing we're going to do, we're going to take this whole cassette guy, and inside of here, there's two bearings. You have an inboard bearing. You're not going to be able to really see that because it's down inside the Freehub, and this outboard bearing that's here. And the way to test those is to just take your finger and press down on the inner race. So if you remember the other video that we had, we talked about the inner and outer race. You want to press on the inner race and make sure that when you rotate this, you're going to rotate the whole Freehub body. You're going to hold that inner race. And if you feel any kind of grinding, or if you feel that there's movement, I'm just going to show you another bearing here. Because remember, when we're talking about cartridge bearings, this is all one piece. So if you feel any kind of movement in this bearing, so that in the inner race and outer race are moving relative to each other or tilting, that's a bad bearing and it has to go. So that's what you're looking for. So in our case, We're going to check both the inboard and the outboard and just make sure. And this is, again, something that you're going to want to do pretty regularly, because catching this in time is going to save you a huge headache. And you're going to see some photos that we're going to post later of what happens to these bearings and what happens to the inside of your Freehub when you don't. And it's a big problem. So for our purposes right now, we're just going to say, you know what, this is no good. We're going to need to get this thing off of here. So temporarily, we're going to put this all back together. All right. Thanks, guys, for your patience while I degrease my fingers. The reason that we're putting this axle cap back on is because the next thing we need to do is to remove the cassette, right? You're not going to be able to work on the Freehub safely when it's got this shuriken attached to it. So we want to make sure that all this stuff is removed. So I know you guys have all at some point either used or have seen use the chain whip. So I just want to remind you the direction of the chain whip. For some reason, a lot of people get confused. So if you remember, lefty loosey, righty tighty, whichever direction you're turning, in our case, we're loosening it, that is the direction the tail of your chain whip needs to go. So we're turning left, the tail's gonna go over here. I'm gonna take our wrench, and this is just a regular wrench. We don't need a torque wrench for this part, but I do wanna remind you guys, there are differences between the Shimano lock ring and a Campagnolo. So if you're using the old Edco Freehub and you have the Edco lock ring on here, it requires Campagnolo, even though it will fit a Shimano. What happens, I wish I had one here to show you guys. I don't have one handy. But basically, the spacing of the Campagnolo is a little greater. So what happens is that you accelerate the wrench and then you shear the teeth of your lock ring and then it gets stuck. So you really, that's a really bad situation. You don't want that. So make sure if you're using the old Edco or Campagnolo Freehub body that you're using the right lock ring. So then we're going to take this guy off. This can also require a lot of pressure. So remember, you want to use as much leverage to your advantage as possible. You don't want to start these really wide. You want to start them just like this. You know, 1 and 11 is pretty good. And away we go. Oops. So we're going to take this lock ring off. We're going to set this aside, and we're also going to take off this first cog. And the next thing we're going to do, if you guys happen to have 11-speed bikes, or if you have a 10-speed and happen to have an 11-speed cassette laying around, the Shimanos come with this really handy tool. And this is a tip that I got from Shane Miller, and I want to share it with you guys. You can line up the wide spline of this with the smallest spline here. And now when you want to take the cassette off, it just slides right off, and you can also grab your spacers from behind there as well. And now it's just in one piece, and that's going to make installation really easy, because similarly, we're just going to slide it on and the whole thing is going to go on in one shot. It's a little bit of a time saver, especially if you do this often. So we're going to put this guy on here. We're going to set these guys aside for right now. Okay. So next, we need to get this Freehub body off again. One of the things I want to tell you guys, this, and I'll show you about that. I'll talk about that in a little bit. Never mind about that. Okay. So this is the only part that we want in our hand. This is our Freehub. And then, like I was saying, you can see the bearings a little better here. The critical part about this is that there is a spacer that fits between these bearings, and the purpose of the spacer is to ensure that as you're tightening down your quick release adapter, if that spacer wasn't there, you would keep pulling this this outer bearing inboard, which you don't want. So the next part that we need to do is we're going to get this outer bearing out. This is what we call the outboard bearing. It's facing the furthest outboard. So next we need our sealed bearing removal tool. And there's another couple of tools that I want to show you guys. You can either use regular wrenches like these, and you're going to need a 13 and a 15, or you can use a locking combination like this one. I love this tool. I use this for so many different things because it's very handy and it's got straight jaws on it, so it's pretty convenient. So I want to show you guys how that works. When you tighten down on this, you're just going to wiggle it until it feels pretty tight, and then this clamps on. And now basically I can rotate this any direction I want and I don't need to worry about it falling out, and it gives me better access to use the tools that I need to tighten this. So it's really just kind of a time saver. So this sealed bearing extractor is going to go inside of the Freehub body. But as I mentioned before, there's this spacer that's inside of here, and it's really important that you only grab the bearing and you don't grab the spacer. So let me just show you. If I take this and I slide this all the way down inside of here, it will gladly go all the way in, and that's not what you want, because that grabs that aluminum spacer, which is really soft and really thin. So what you want instead is to push this over to the side, this little spacer, and you're going to drop this in so that this part of the sealed bearing extractor sits on top of that spacer, because then you know that's all you're going to grab is the bearing, right? Once that's sitting on there, feels nice and cozy. The next part we want to do is we're going to tighten up the end nut here. And just like before, you want to use your mechanical advantage. So you want to tighten this up a little, and also make sure that you can still move that spacer inside, because you really want to make sure that you don't have that grabbed. Now we can set this wrench aside. Okay. So if you really want to feel how bad your bearings are, turn this while you're holding on to it. And if you have a bad bearing, you are going to know right away, because you're going to feel all those vibrations through this little guy, and it's going to feel terrible, and you'll definitely know. So the next step is we're going to come over to, we're going to take our pin punch, and you want either a soft blow or a dead blow hammer. This is a dead blow hammer, but you can use a soft blow. The reason for that is you've got hardened steel and hardened steel and hardened steel, and you don't want a non-hardened steel anything else, because that's when pieces are going to come off and stab you in the eyeballs. So you don't want that. So we're going to come over here to the vise. There are a couple of different ways you can manage this. I made my own holder, so if you have something like this, you can do it like this, but a vise is going to be the better option for you, and I'll show you how that works in a little bit also. When you're putting this in the vise, soft jaws for sure. You don't want to do this in your regular steel jaws. And when you're installing this, you want to make sure that the bottom of your extractor is beyond this part of your vise. You don't want to smack this into the bottom of the tool, right? So have it over to the side so that it's not in your way. So remember, the reason that I have this catch basket here is because that spacer is going to come flying out, and we want to make sure that it doesn't become a cat toy. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to take our pin punch and our dead blow hammer, and we're going to very gently just apply this to the end of the pin, and we're going to tap this guy out. And it doesn't require a lot of effort, so you don't have to smack this like you don't have to Lou Ferrigno it. You just tap. Shazam.
Okay, we have a couple questions.
Okay.
One is this an OG Neo?
This is an OG Neo. This is the OGest Neo that I own. This is a 2015. It is serial number 123 in the world.
Okay. The other question is, where does one purchase the bearings?
It depends on where you are. I mean, like, what we would like to see is, Hambini, you guys know we're friends with Hambini. Hambini's friends with us. He will be coming on our show in a couple of days. He's, like I said, recovering from his accident. In the United States, I use a company called Motion Industries. I have a partnership with them, but Hambini is obviously a supplier also. So we want to get you guys the best rates that we can for those. So we'll have recommendations based on where you are on the website. So in the United States, Motion Industries is my go-to. So anyway, looking back now at our extractor and our spacer. The spacer you can just kind of leave in here. We don't need it for right now. But you can see, if you look at the shoulder of where that is on that, that's a pretty good grab, because the only thing we grabbed was the bearing. So the next thing we want to do is we have to get that guy off there. Sometimes with a sealed bearing extractor, what will happen is that the pin that's in the extractor is going to feel like it's stuck, but it's really not stuck. Of course, right now it's not doing it, but if it does get stuck, all you need to do is just wind this down and go over to your anvil and just go tap, and then you just see the bearing's going to fall out. And there we go. This bearing is out. Okay, and so this is the next reason that you need to have on your safety glasses, because this next part is where it really gets a little hairy. If you look down inside here, what is the best place for you to, do you want to be over here or over there?
I'm okay here.
Okay. This might be a little hard for you guys to see, but down inside there, the next bearing that's down in the inboard bearing, there is what we call a snap ring. Some people call it a circlip. Some people call it a C-clip. But yeah, that guy is down inside of there. And now we're dealing with spring loads. So I want to show you before we even get to that. Come take a look at this for me real quick. When we start talking about this kind of C-clip, these are both Edcos. So you see, this is the later version. This is an earlier version that has this dark coloring on the outside. So if you look at this circlip, I want to show you. See how that circlip, how the holes in there are not complete? They had to trim that so that it missed the inner race of the bearing, and that's a dangerous situation because there's not a way for your snap ring pliers to grab a hold of this snap ring. So this is especially dangerous, but it's always a little bit dangerous because we're dealing with spring loads. So I just want to let you guys know again, with the safety glasses, when you're dealing with a spring load, especially when it's kind of containerized like this, if your pliers slip, there are two things that can potentially happen. One is that your snap ring is going to get stuck inside your Freehub body, not the end of the world. And the other thing is that the snap ring will come out of this Freehub at Mach 5 towards your face. So you want to make sure that that's not going to happen. So with your snap ring pliers, let me just show you out here before we even get into this. Let me show you what this looks like. Down inside of there, you have this snap ring, and there's little holes. And these little pegs, they call them the pins of your snap ring pliers, fit into those holes. Oops. And you can tell I don't have my regular glasses on because this would be a little bit easier. So once those pins are in those holes, I don't know if you guys can see that, but it's pretty stable, and you can squeeze this part together. I'm going to face it away from the camera, but you're basically changing the circumference here. You're changing this by squeezing these parts together, and that's what you need to do. The snap ring fits inside a groove that's down inside the Freehub body, and we need to get that part out to remove that lower bearing. So we're going to get our pliers lined up inside here. Like I said, we're doing this live, so it's never going to be quite as fun as it is when you have a chance to have multiple takes and screw it up. But basically, once this is set, you're going to grab that and squeeze those pliers together. And if you guys ever played the game Operation when you were a kid, it's going to be a little bit like that. You're going to grab, once you have a hold of that part, you want to get it out of there. I'm really having a hard time grabbing it. There we go. Okay. So the way to do this is once you have it and it's squeezed, you're going to tilt back and you're going to lift out real gently. You don't want to drag it on the sides because that's how you lose the snap ring. So once that's out, you're going to set that guy aside, and we're pretty much done with this for the time being. So the next part we're going to do, you could bash this out, but I'm going to show you in some other photos that we have. This is going to be part of the other presentation. I'll have it on the website. I don't know if you can see inside there, but basically you've got a constriction in the top, then you've got a little space, and you've got another constriction. So if you were to try to use a blind hole puller, you're going to be able to pull this bearing out of the bottom constriction, and then it's going to get stuck. So this is why having a bearing press is going to save us a lot of time, and that's exactly what we're going to use for this. Okay. This is a 17mm bearing guide. And what we're going to do is place this on the bottom of our bearing press, like so. And then we're going to take the Freehub and we're going to drop it paws down onto this 17mm. And the 17mm is going to do the job of keeping that straight for us. And then the other thing we want is a cap for this. And we're going to use a 6804. So the cap, in this case, what we want to do is make sure that we have a way to allow clearance for this to drop out. And you're going to see as we press this out where the constrictions are. So the purpose of these guides is to keep everything straight and level because we don't want any tilting, right? So once these are in place, you can't move this. It's not going to be able to wiggle. It can only go in one direction and it's square. So what you're going to see as the 17mm press that's on the bottom starts to do its job, you're going to see it push out of the first constriction. You're going to see it drop into the space. So give us a second here. And you'll kind of feel it as you're going that it starts to get a little bit lighter. Okay, so we just dropped out of the first constriction. Now we're moving on to the next, and then it's going to drop the rest of the way. The Freehub body will itself drop all the way to the bottom here. Give us a second. Let's see what's going on. Okay. So now if you look here, you can see that the bearing is just about out. It's held in by the tiniest little bit. So we can just take this and push it out like that. So now our second bearing is out. And this is what the inside of your Freehub looks like. So typically the Freehub itself should be in pretty good shape. It's pretty rare for there to be any complications in there unless you've let your bearings deteriorate. And then you've got a whole host of problems.
Can we just pause for another question and information? There's been some questions about where this is going to be posted. If it's going to be on YouTube or the website or both?
No, guys, this is just a live thing. We're just doing this for your benefit. There's going to be a much more detailed video that will be up on the YouTube channel and also on this, but this is just a live video because there were a lot of questions about what was going on and how to tackle these things. And so before the tidal wave of misdirection happened, I wanted to show you that this is how it's done. So this is just a quick walkthrough.
Okay, the other questions were about tools. Are you going to include links to the tools at some point?
Not in this video, but yeah, in other videos for sure.
Okay.
Okay, so just like before, we took that snap ring out. We need to put all this stuff back together now. So every Freehub body and every kind of bearing that we're going to use needs what we call a base. So the base for this is either going to be a 1728 or I think a 6803. I don't remember off the top of my head. But basically you want some kind of 17mm. So we're going to drop this guy on here. Next, our Freehub body is going to go back on. And then we want the bearing drift. So the bearing drift for this is a 6902. Let me find that. Again, this is for a tack Shimano. The drifts and the bases that you use are going to depend. So for this one, the drift for the bearing is a 6802. For this one, it's a 6902. For the Neo 2T, it's a 6803 rather. So next, if you remember what we were saying before, we need to get this guy in there. So we're going to install here our 6902 on our bearing, and you see how closely they line up. And because we need to push this all the way into the bottom, we're going to use that 17mm guide again, except now it's going to be on top of the sandwich, right? And just like before, when we were pressing the bearing out, what you're going to see is that this is going to drop as it goes past that constriction. You see? So now we're into the first constriction. I can feel it tightening up. and then it drops, and now it's in this space, right? So now we need to push it into the bottom constriction. And this is, again, pretty important that you press this all the way into the bottom. And the reason why is because you have to remember we have that snap ring, and the snap ring has a very, very small area that it's going to fit into. So you want to make sure that you have that bearing, that lower bearing, snugged in pretty tight.
Okay, we have just one more question. Is the construction largely different on later models, or are the differences on the inner workings of the trainer?
I mean, for the most part, they're exactly the same. The Freehub bodies are a little bit different. The Neo 2T does not have this constriction that we were talking about. It's a straight Freehub. But as far as the mechanics, the only thing that changed between all these different versions, the axle obviously on Neo 2T and the electronics on Neo 2, but those are also shared with 2T. They also have the same firmware for that reason as well. So now that we have our lower bearing in place, the next thing we're going to do is, just as before, we're going to grab this snap ring. And make sure, like really take a moment to make sure that it's on there well, because if it's off by a little, like I was saying, like it is pretty dangerous. So we're going to lower this guy in there, nice and gentle, tilt it up, and let go. So right now you can see, I'm not sure, that's not even all the way in. If you're not sure, you can press it down and you're going to hear it click. Did you hear that snap? It's doing its job. So the snap ring is in place, the lower bearing is in place, and we're good. So far, so good. So the next thing that we're going to need is this spacer alignment guide. And its job is to make sure, because we have this snap ring down here, what we don't want is, if you guys remember, there's a spacer between the two bearings. What you don't want when you're putting this back together is that that spacer rides up on top of the snap ring, because then when you try to push that top bearing in, it's not going to be in the right place. So we use the alignment guide to hold that in place. So when we build our little stack here, this spacer is going to sit on that guide. So let's rebuild our sandwich here.
Do you ever train on your Neos?
That's a good question. Not as much as I would like to. You know, it's like, so right now, training for Ironman, you know, as much as I would like to say I'm on the bike more, I'm really actually doing a lot more running and swimming right now. Okay, so right now, we're gonna put our spacer alignment guide down here, and you'll see that. So what's gonna happen is, again, the purpose of this is to keep all these parts together. So now I'm gonna show you just really quick. So without that spacer guide, see how this can wiggle? That's what we don't want. And so this piece is going to fit inside the bearing that we already installed. Once that's in there, now it can't wiggle. Then we're going to put the spacer on top of there. So if you look, there's a little bit of daylight between the spacer and the alignment guide, right? So next, just like we did before, we're going to take our 6902. We're going to set our bearing on there. And it honestly doesn't really matter for radial bearings. You'll hear some people say that the orange side goes out, but for radial bearings, it honestly doesn't matter. So yeah, so we've got our sandwich stacked up here again. You don't need the guide for the top piece. It just makes it a little quicker because you're just taking out all that thread dimension, so you don't have to crank this top down as far. I'm going to warn you guys right now that when you're doing your Freehub, I guarantee you that you're going to put this top piece in too hard. So we're turning this till it stops, okay? And now, you're not going to crank on that because you don't want that, not like the bottom piece, you just want that to be in just a little bit. It has to be in its constriction, and that's pretty much where that goes, right? But if you remember from before, where we were able to move that spacer, now that guy is kind of jammed in there. And so you're going to have the bearing move, and all the bearings and that spacer are going to move together, which is not the end of the world, but there's a quick resolution. We're going to take this guy. If you guys remember from physics class, conservation and momentum, we're just going to take this 17 millimeter guide, and our drift hammer, and we're just going to tap this. You don't need to smack it again. We're not using guerrilla force. It's a tap. And then the energy that we provided to that is going to allow the spacer to move around again, but not enough to knock the bearing free. Groovy? Okay. So now that that's done, our Freehub is back in great shape. We can set this aside. Well done. Good job. New bearings in your Freehub. Everyone's happy. The next thing is we're going to take our main disc apart. So I know you guys have probably also seen these videos as well, talking about the Neodisc. I'm going to warn you right now that there is one rule that is the golden rule when we start talking about Neodisc. You have to remember that this thing is full of neodymium magnets that are very strong. So we do the arm's length rule. Wherever you put your Neodisc, your tools go over here. Because the neodymium magnets, in addition to being very strong, are also very brittle. And if you have a tool like this that will roll and the Neo has a chance to grab it, it will. And you can shatter the magnets, and again, pieces will go into your eyeballs, which we don't want. So the next thing you're going to need is your 4mm Allen. And basically you're going to take off every other one until 3 of these are off. Some of these can be a little tight. Make sure that your tool is firmly installed in there before, because sometimes you might have to add your torque on these to get them to move. So I mentioned before that I was going to talk about why these wrenches, what's so special about these wrenches. The reason that I like them, these guys have a little tiny spring-loaded bearing in the bottom, it's a little bearing there. So what happens is that when you insert that in, just like a magnetic, it will hold on to the screw so that your pieces don't get lost. The downside of that is if you're working on, like, let's say you're working on a stem, like stem bolts from your headset, and there's a lock ring behind that. If you pull that straight off, that lock ring is going to come off that stem bolt at Mach 5 and you will never see it again. So always make sure before you extract, that there's not some other piece behind there that's not going to come flying off. So basically you're going to take off every other bolt. We can set these aside for right now. And then we're going to go pick up our extractor and our 5mm. And we're going to install this guy on here. So another thing that I wanted to tell you guys with extractors, if you're working on multiple Neos, as sometimes happens, this is what I call the danger position, right? When you have this bolt that's extended, that is the danger position. So if you're moving a bolt from one side, from one Neo to another, make sure that that is all the way threaded in, because otherwise when this disc starts to come in contact with those magnets, it will yank it out of your hand, and it can remove fingers and family members and who knows what. Just make sure these are snug. Again, you're not putting a ton of torque on these. You're really just making sure that they're tight so that you can remove this Neodisc. Okay. I'm going to cheat because sometimes I do. 15/16 for the regular bolt that comes with Neo. Use a low speed if you're going to use one, and make sure you have, if you can, set a torque on this so that it doesn't go flying out of your hands. Basically, you're driving the bolt in, which is going to push the disc out, and you'll find a natural place where you'll feel that it's just not pushing any further off, and that's where you want to stop. So you're going to hold with this hand, and you're going to just turn that. You can turn it with a wrench or turn it with whatever you happen to have handy. This just makes it a little more efficient. And you can already feel like it's off, so you don't need to go any further than that. Okay. Nope, maybe I lied. We might need to go a little further than that. I'm glad we're doing this live so we can see this going on, because I'm really not sure what just happened there. Un momento, por favor. What on earth? Okay. Give us a moment. Sorry, guys. I need to really kind of figure out what's happening here. Wait a minute. I think I know what I did. And let this be a warning to all of you. I suspect that what I did accidentally was left the ring on the inside, the plain bearing. I hope I didn't, but it's possible. That's exactly what happened. So this is why when I reinstalled that hub before we put this back on, that's why we're not able to remove this. So sorry about that, guys. Learn from that mistake. You want to make sure that that guy is off of your axle before you try to remove that. My bad. So anyway, as we were saying, we're going to install these bolts in here. This is with your 5mm, and it doesn't matter which version of Neo. The extractor is pretty much the same. The blue version for Neo 2T will also fit your Neo and Neo 2.
Can we have a question for a minute?
Of course.
There's a question from Anna. Do you go to the tools you got from Sweden?
Yeah, we're going to show that in just a minute. In fact, the hilarious part is I haven't even opened them yet, so we're going to do that real time as well. Why not? So, okay, here we go. Take 2 of removing the Neodisc. So again, we're just going to nice and slow. We're going to move this guy in. And yeah, you can kind of tell, like when it lets go, you can tell that it let go. So again, tools over here, Neodisc over here. So as far as this part of the Neo goes, there's really not a whole lot for you to ever be concerned with. So there's nothing mechanical inside of there. There's nothing to look at. There's nothing to check. The only thing that you could look at if you have a problem with the axle, that's a good opportunity to examine the axle. We're also going to talk about that because just last week, I'm not even joking, we had the first instance of someone who had the suede broke on their Neo, and they took it to someone who was an outstanding machinist and metallurgist who welded it, put a bunch of welds inside of it, and then put that on the lathe to smooth out the weld spots, and was able to put it all back together and got a working Neo from the dead, which is pretty awesome, and I love those kinds of stories. So the next thing, once you've got this guy off, I know you've seen a few videos, not only of mine, but of other videos where people have taken this hub now completely out. We're not going to do that right now because I want to show you how this is intended to be used and why this ring nut has been such a problem. So with Neo, again, your Freehub is what has been tightening this since the last time you ever checked this, and it can be extremely, extremely tight. So this guy goes inside here, but you're not going to use a wrench on this to turn this. Instead, this whole piece, see these little guys here? This little ledge is what's going to fit into your vise. So for you guys who have seen the recent announcement from Garmin for their Freehub service that they're going to provide, that is definitely the preferred mechanism, right? If you have the option to choose that, you're obviously going to choose that. So back to the question that Anna was asking. I'm just going to spaz here for a minute because I don't know what I did with that part. No, wait, I see it. This came from Sweden. This is the same tool as this, except this one is for the Neo 2T. I literally haven't opened it yet, so let's go take a peek. See what's inside. I'm probably never going to get this open with my fingers, but let's try. So I'm pretty excited to do this. I may even actually do another video where we just do the same process for Neo 2T. Nice. So this is the tool that Holger made for us and is going to make continually for Neo 2T owners. The difference is this is, I would like to see this a little bit higher so that it can fit inside the vise, and I'm going to show you again in a minute how this will work. The reason I say that is because this is actually pretty shallow. So when you see how deep that is, there's not going to be a lot for you to grab onto with either a vise or a wrench. So that I would like to see a little bit different. But as long as this works, as long as we can put something on it, we can move ahead with Neo 2T, which is awesome news. So I want to say a huge thanks to Holger Kook for providing us with not only with the tool, but also for sending it over here to the United States for us to look at. I wish we had a chance earlier to tackle it for Neo 2T. We just haven't yet. So anyway, getting back to the Neo original, this is the DT Swiss tool that you've probably heard so much about in recent weeks, and the reason it's designed this way is because this piece is meant to fit in a bench vise just like this. So you don't put the tool in the disc and then try to turn it. You put the tool in the vise and then you put the disc on the tool. The reason for that is because some of these can be extremely, extremely tight, and having a wider surface is going to give you more leverage, right? So some of these can be so tight, I mean, like literally you put yourself in the right stance. I think I've changed the rotation of the earth on its axis trying to remove some of these, so they really can be tight. And it's basically the same thing. It's lefty. Ow. And then once it starts to spin, you can lift it back off. Then you can take that part out of your vise and then you remove the rest of it by hand. And I want to tell you guys, again, with this ring nut, this is a very delicate part for all versions of Neo. The stainless version that this one is using, a lot of versions, 2015, 2016, 2017 and 18 have a hardened one, so it's not quite as brittle. You want to make sure that you don't cross thread this guy, and so you really want to take your time. We'll burn that bridge also when we get to it. So going back to this little holder, we have this holder which is really convenient when we're working on this because you just drop it in, do whatever you want to do on it, and it keeps it out of your way. So for our purposes, the next thing we want to do is remove the bearing. And there's two basic ways that we can do this. With the sealed extractor like we used before, and you can pull it out with the bearing press, or you can use the sealed extractor and hammer it out. And this is a regular, what we call in the United States, dimensional lumber. This is 2x4 cedar. But basically, yeah, this is going to give you plenty of clearance to knock out that bearing. So we're going to do that right now.
Okay, we have a question from Hans about, can I paint the disc?
No, I'll tell you why. The reason that you cannot paint the disc is because the disc is actually a heat sink. It is doing a job of removing heat from the Neo at all times. And so any kind of coating that you put on here is going to become an insulator, and you're going to overheat your Neo that way. So you don't want that.
It would be pretty though.
Yeah, you know, and the funny thing is, the reason I know the answer to that is I had actually asked Martin Smith from Tax about that a while ago because I wanted to mirror finish mine.
Yeah, there's just a comment about that as well.
And yeah, the answer that I got was don't you dare. So I'm going to share that with you as well. Don't you dare. So again, just like with your Freehub body, you're going to make sure you don't have to worry about spacers. There's no spacers in here. Give yourself leverage. Remember, you just want to have your wrenches so that you can get the most efficient grip. You don't want to start with them really far apart. You just want them near each other. And that feels pretty good. The reason that you want this tight is because if it's not, as you start to smack on this, you drive the extractor out and the bearing stays behind. Okay, so once that's in place, you'll kind of feel it where it centers, and then it's the same process. You're going to use your pin punch and your soft blow hammer, and you're going to tap. You don't have to go gorilla on this. This bearing can be pretty tight, the inboard bearing, but for the outboard bearing, it's usually pretty loose. There we go. It's already out. Okay, so remember, disc in one place, tool somewhere else. So this one may, in fact, give us a good example of what happens when the bearing gets stuck on the drift. This is again why the locking is just a little nicer than using 2 wrenches, because it's kind of hard sometimes to manage 2 wrenches. No, this one also is coming off no problem. So there you go. Mr. Bearing is out. So we're going to set that aside. We're going to set aside that extractor. We're going to go over here and we're going to get our 25, I think this is a 20 actually, millimeter extractor. And the same thing, we're going to go right inside here. What I am missing is give me 1 second, guys, because so again, if you're wondering why am I using this instead of putting this in the vise, because you could put this in the vise, and it is because these magnets are going to pull on this steel, and it's going to be very, very lopsided. And when you're smacking this and it starts to wiggle around, you could have a real problem on your hands. Again, not only with pieces of the magnets flying off, but also just them breaking in general and then having to replace this entire disc. So generally I want to avoid putting this in the vise. Give me 1 second, I need to wander away and find a wrench. Apologies for that. So for this extractor, you do need a 17 millimeter wrench for the top nut. And just like before, a little too much. We're going to just tighten this guy down. And we're done with these for right now, so they're going to get set aside. And just like before, we've got this little track. It fits nicely. And you're just going to use your punch and line it up with the pin of the extractor and tap. I think there she blows, but I'm not sure. There she goes. Okay. And that's it. So now you can see here is your main disc and what it looks like when there's no bearings inside. And here is your drift. I'm sorry, the extractor with the bearing stuck on it. We're going to take that off. Okay, so this guy did get stuck. You can see the bearing is still on there. And it's not actually the bearing that's stuck, it's that the pin is caught in this expansion arbor. So what you need to do is just lower this, make the end nut a little even with the pin, and you're just gonna tap. Just like that, and then the bearing will come off. Okay, so we're done with our extractors, we're done with everything else.
There was one more question just now.
Yep.
Why not a slide hammer?
I'll tell you why. The slide hammer, when you're using a slide hammer, if you're using a piece like this on a slide hammer, you have to hold down the piece and keep the bearing straight, because when you're using a slide hammer, I should go grab that and show you guys, but maybe for another video. But basically the slide hammer can move around. It doesn't necessarily stay straight. And while you're moving, the rotation of your arm is not vertical, right? So you're trying to keep the bearing straight without getting trapped in here, and you're trying to maintain the piece. And sometimes that motion can also be pretty tough. So using an extractor, gravity's on your side. You're pushing the bearing downward, and you're not having to manage both this and the hammer, because the slide hammer, like I have a 5-pound slide hammer, and that can be a pretty good workout if you have a tough bearing. So where this, you can always wind up and add more hammer blow, but you may be there all day, especially with some bearings. This is true like on motorcycle parts where you actually have blind holes, where it's not going to be able to fit in a vise and you're not going to have a nice holder. Trying to hold down that piece while you're pulling out really stubborn bearings, man, it could be an all-day affair and it's not very fun. So having the sealed extractor just makes that job way quicker. Plus, you only have to buy the extractors that you need, and you're not buying a whole kit that comes with the slide hammer. So that's my rationale. So again, this is where having this is super handy, because you can just drop it in here. Your hand's free to do whatever else you need to do. The next part that we're going to do is back to our bearing press. So if you guys remember, we were talking before about having the bearings and putting them where they go. So make sure that the bearing, when you're installing it, is nice and tidy on there. Nice fit. This is a really, really tight fit, which is great. This is exactly what we want for this bearing.
Okay, we had another bearing question. Do you recommend greasing the outside of the bearing or the bearing housing before pressing it back in?
I totally don't recommend that at all, because really it's the whole purpose of having that is of having lubrication is to remove friction, right? We want friction. We want that bearing to stay in there. If you're having a problem, you're never going to have a problem pressing the bearing in. So I wouldn't worry too much about that. And let me bring up another point, because someone had asked this earlier. Sometimes you'll see people, when they're trying to remove a bearing that's a really stubborn bearing, they'll apply heat to this, right? They'll apply heat to a main hub. If you have the hub out, you could maybe do that, but heat is the enemy of magnets. They'll lose their magnetism when you apply heat, so you don't want to heat this at all any more than it normally operates at, right? So you'll see guys who will use like a gas torch, and they'll actually heat it up. You don't want to do that with your Neodisc. So yeah, no lubrication. You really don't need it.
Yeah, there were a bunch of other questions too, but I think we might have to keep going for now.
So this little holder is super convenient, because again, trying to do this without some way to hold it, you'd be holding, let me just show you this also. For a really nice set like this piece is going to be flat. So when you set it on a table, it will sit like this. So you can sort of make your stack like this, and you can put your pieces on, and it will actually stand up pretty well. But it's nicer to have hands free, so you can still kind of see what's happening. So remember, the bearing press and the bearing drifts that you use, their whole purpose is to keep everything straight and level, and to minimize the possibility of one of these bearings, especially one of this size, going in crooked, because if it does, you are going to have a major, major problem. So we're just going to slide this down here, and you're not going to really press too hard. You're just going to get it started, and the same on the other side. I was going to say, is there a better view for this here?
Okay.
And also, I just want to let you guys know, all these pieces that we have, these are all aluminum. So that's why there's no hesitation about moving these around. This disc, because this is all aluminum stuff. So you can press these in at the same time. It's kind of one of the nice things is of having a bearing press is that once everything starts to move, you're going to see. So now that the right hand side here is the outboard already moved into its place, and now we're just kind of rotating this inboard bearing, and you can see it just little by little going home. So the other reason that you need the correct bearing drist for this is that you'll see with the Neo main hub, the boss that's here is actually a little bit deeper than the bearing itself. So what happens is that if you had a drift that was not the appropriate size or that was oversized for the housing, the bearing would not fit into the boss the way that it's supposed to. Okay, so those guys are done. They're out. Okay, so the next thing we need to do is just poke these press pieces out. There's one drift, and here's the other one in a moment. Wow, that is a tight fit. Man, oh man. I would actually tap that guy out. So yeah, we had these parts custom made. They are so precision, it's like maybe a little too precise. But anyway, so now we got brand new bearings, and now the next part is going to be to reinstall our ring nut. And there is a correct and incorrect direction to install this. You always want to make sure the flat parts are pointing to the left. So if you see this, flat parts to the left. And again, this is a really important part where you want to make sure that when you're installing this, that it's nice and straight, because once this goes in crooked, you've got a problem. And it may even take a couple tries or just a couple of minutes to find like the exact correct place. But don't start it crooked. Come on. Any other questions while I manage to try to get this back in?
Hold on. There's a few more. Let me just make sure Something about why don't you change the complete bearing kit?
So the new, that's a brand new thing that came up with Garmin, and you're correct that it is the preferred method. The difference is that if you already have all the tools, it's going to be way more affordable for you just to replace the bearings. And we're also not sure right now where those kits are available. We know they're available in the United States, but we don't know where else. And if history is kind of any indication, we have no idea that they're going to be generally available. So that's why we need the parts like the ones that Holger made and the other tools that we're going to show you these other techniques, because depending on where you are in the world, you're not going to be able to buy that Garmin kit. That's what we suspect, right? We know that it's true today, that you can't just go buy one of those. We suspect that it will also be true in the future, but we just don't know, and Garmin's not going to tell us, so we don't.
Okay, then sort of a tie-in question.
Yeah.
Kind of two parts. Somebody had asked earlier, isn't it cheaper to buy a new Freehub? And then also somebody asked, isn't it cheaper to buy a new Neo than all the special tools?
No, it is definitely not cheaper to buy a new Neo. And
close though.
As far as buying a new Freehub, yeah, you could certainly buy a new Freehub, and it's just going to depend, of course, on the quality of whatever bearings you're putting in as far as the Freehub, because buying a Freehub that has garbage bearings and then having to replace that more frequently is not really a solution to any problem either. Okay. So that's it for doing the Neo disc bearing, and then I want to show you how to just reassemble this. I'm sure you guys have probably seen this a million times. So thank you guys for joining. If you want to see the rest of the video, I'm going to complete this process, but that is how to remove and reinstall bearings 101 for Freehub bodies and Neo main disc. Hope that it was educational and enlightening. You got to see me make a silly mistake, which is super fun. And again, this is the safe position, not the danger position. So this is okay to reinstall our disc. But yeah, so the point is that, you know, if you already have all these tools, which I know a lot of you guys might, a lot of you guys might not, I don't really know. If you go to any bike shop, most of the stuff they're going to have already. Or if you guys want to just basically, the point is to empower you to be in charge of your own destiny as far as your Neo maintenance, and not being like, oh man, now I've got to go buy a part and it's got to be from Garmin, and where am I going to find this? You don't have to do that. You can be in charge of your own destiny. Just like before, very gentle. And you'll know when it stops. Put my big stupid head in the way.
Going back a bit, how tight is the lock nut supposed to be?
The lock nut of what?
I'm not sure. How tight for the lock nut?
How tight for the lock nut? If we're talking about the lock ring for the cassette, it's you know, there's a range, 30 to 50 Newton meters. Why it's a range, I don't know. I don't know why they just don't say 40 instead of saying 30 to 50. I'm not sure what lock nut you mean. Whoever's asking that, can you be more specific? If you're talking about the ring nut, are you talking about the ring nut, the retaining ring nut for the cassette? For this?
I'm not sure.
Okay.
We'll see if he asks more.
So as far as
lock ring.
Lock ring for the cassette?
John is asking about the lock ring. How tight is that?
The lock ring for the cassette is 40 Newton meters. The ring nut, is as tight as you want it to be for your fingers. Because remember, ultimately what goes on here is your Freehub, right? And so you are constantly tightening this with your legs. So ultimately this may have hundreds and hundreds of Newton meters of torque, which is why it can be extremely difficult to get this off. I'm not even kidding when I say I've had to use a 30-inch breaker bar to get this off on some Neos that we worked on. So you don't have to tighten this. This just has to be on there so that it holds the bearing in place. And over time, you will tighten it beyond anything that your arms can ever manage.
Okay, I think that's what he was asking.
Okay. Next, we're going to reinstall these little screws. These we are going to give a little bit of courtesy lubrication.
And there were some comments about the rubber O-rings on the axle. Do you put grease on those?
The rubber O-rings on the axle, it's going to depend on the version. This is such an early version that it didn't actually have them, so I would have shown you that otherwise. You don't really need to grease those, but you do need to check the condition. Or maybe then in the next one I'll do either a 2016 or a 2017 and show you what that looks like. But yeah, they really don't need any kind of lubrication.
Don't forget the black spacer.
I'm not going to forget the black spacer. We're going to talk about that right now. So normally when you're doing this service, and as I said, I know that Tax recommends that you do this service annually. I'm telling you, it's not enough. 3 months is when you should be doing this, and then you should be checking your bearings. The grease that I use, this is Motor X 2000. It's very similar to the Shimano grease, and you really want to apply that pretty liberally inside and out. You don't have to grease the axle itself because this will do that job when you install it. that. So the Motor X2000, not only do I use it for the axle, I also use this for other bearings on other bikes and other parts. It's kind of the bomb. It's like it is really the one that I use for just about everything. It just solves a lot of problems. It's super pressure resistant, super water resistant. And this piece again, it's just finger tight. So I don't have any spacers on the inside of this, but it's going to bottom out. So when it stops turning, just stop. You don't have to go any tight. You don't have to like crank on this. If you're putting this end of the wrench in and cranking on it, you're going too hard. Are you done? You got the Rona?
No.
Okay. It's like we were saying before, you're going to find that pin here on your Freehub body. Find it here on this part of the, and then when you go to install this, swoop, you're done. Again, shout out to Shane Miller, GP Llama, for that tip, because it has saved me so much time. Actually, I end up doing this a lot. I do a lot of work on Neos for people, and that little time saver, wow, just what a lifesaver. Okay, and finally we're going to be back to our chain whip. And the next thing we need is this. If you guys don't have one of these, you want to try to borrow one. This is a torque wrench. This is a Norbar 60. This is nice because it's reversible, so I can use it for crank arms and pedals as well. We're going to crank this guy up to 40 Newton meters. And grab our cassette tool that's already here, and just need to find this guy. Okay, now remember we were talking before about the chain whip, lefty loosey, righty tighty. So we want to go tight. The tail is going to go in that direction. We'll lock this guy in here. Now you guys already know this, but 40 Newton meters is quite a lot. So that's what we're saying when we're talking about the inside of that ring nut that can be hundreds of Newton meters. It can take quite a lot of force to get that off. There we go. And that's it. Our Neo is reinstalled. We've got all the bearings of everything replaced, and this Neo is good for another 11, hopefully 1,000 miles.
There was a question about how many hours of use are we assuming per week if it requires a service and inspection every 3 months?
I mean, the reality is with COVID right now, I'm assuming that everyone's indoors riding, and if you're not, you should be. So that's really what it comes down to, is just we're seeing increased usage, so we want increased maintenance. So I can tell you that the ones that I've seen destroyed and the bearings that are really bad have been anywhere from, literally, I'm not even joking, 30 days. That was on a Neo 2, where we had, it was brand new from the factory and it was completely destroyed in 30 days. So it's not only just the amount of time and hours. The thing that contributes to bearing failure more than anything else is, first of all, initial quality, because it's going to vary. And secondly, torque. So it's not just how long you use it, it's how much torque you're applying to that bearing. That's really the factor. So it's going to vary. So if I tell you you should check it every 100 hours, but you're 125 pounds and you basically just spin around on Zwift on the easiest routes, then probably your bearings are going to be fine. But if you weigh 225 and you're an absolute masher and you put out huge watts in these sprints and you're 6'5", then yeah, you're going to be in the danger category, where not only are your Freehub bearings going to fail more frequently, definitely your outer bearing of your main disc. Any other questions, or can I take a nap?
There's a few more. Hold on, I can go back. Let me see.
So when you're done with your torque wrench, by the way, always make sure you lower it back down, not to 0, but to whatever its minimum value is. This one has a range.
Okay, there's a question about what bearings, I guess, do you want to get the right tolerance on Neo OG SKF question mark?
Okay, so that's a couple multi-part question kind of. In my opinion, SKF are truly among the best. Like it's very hard to me to come up with a better idea. The challenge is that SKF they don't make bearings for all these sizes of bearing. Let me get rid of safe glasses too. I feel like I'm pretty safe now. SKF don't make all these sizes, and if they do, you can order them special, like for a Freehub body, but it's going to cost you $113 for each bearing, and there's 2 of them. So financially, it doesn't make any sense to use SKF for your Freehub. I use Enduro bearings for my Freehubs, not only on my Neos, but also on my bicycles. Enduro has their very high quality bearings. They're available throughout most of the world, and I've never had a problem getting them. Recently, it was a little tricky to get some, but generally they're going to be pretty widely available. In the United States, Timken has been very widely available in their top quality bearings as well. NTN, obviously top company. So FAG also. These are the brands that you want to look at for your Neo hub bearings. The Neo 2T, they come standard with SKF. There are some variances. I saw that in later versions of Neo 2T, they changed to a C1 from I think what was originally a CN, and that's probably a better idea. I think that the original tolerance was a little too tight, so I think that's probably a better idea. But yeah, SKF is pretty much the top of the heap. But again, you're gonna get what you pay for. If you go on by and you see those stacks on Amazon, I have to laugh. I see them like 10 bearings for $8. Wow. If you put in those in your Neo, I'm gonna slap you. I'll come to your house and I'll stand out on the sidewalk and I'll yell mean things at you. So yeah, don't. I
think Hans is qualifying his question, okay. Not for the Freehub, but for the disc.
For the disc, for sure. SKF, yeah, for sure.
Okay.
SKF is where it's at. If you can get the correct SKF bearings, like I said, if you can find C1s, that's really what you want. You want double sealed, not double shielded. You want double sealed. And again, the reason that you want sealed bearings in your Neo is because it's a bunch of big magnets. And just like you've seen in other videos where something gets stuck in between the magnets and the stator, you can have the same problem where that same piece of whatever happens to get in. So if you have shielded bearings and you give something an opportunity to get in that bearing, it will, and you'll destroy your bearing. So yeah, for sure, you want double sealed. If you can get C1s, that's great. I think C0 is probably a little too much. Look for CNs. If you can find SKF, CN, that's probably what you want.
Okay, I think we'll take one more question from Stevo.
Stevo, what's up?
Stevo wants to know how much of this maintenance we can do without it affecting our warranty.
All of it. None of this affects your warranty. This is all 100% legit. None of this affects your warranty. As long as you're doing these things in a way that was what we're talking about, like I can imagine that there are things that you could do with this where Garmin would shake their head, but this is all basic maintenance. The tools that we're using, like the disc extractor to remove the disc, this is all stuff that's provided by Tax and by Garmin. So they're not gonna balk at you replacing your own bearings. So this is also, I just want to remind you guys, the way that this was done previously, because it does require a lot of tools, was that you would box up your whole Neo and ship it back to the Netherlands, and then they would replace the whole disc and then have to recalibrate your Neo and then send it back to you. So the shipping alone for that process is going to cost more than all these tools. So that's why we're saying, depending on where you are in the world, this is still going to be the go-to.
Okay, I think we got to most of it. So
all right, thanks everybody. Thanks for tuning in. If you guys have any other questions, of course, I'm always around. You can always let me know, and I'm happy to help.